All right, well, welcome everybody to the first episode of our video podcast that we're calling Safer and Secure. Just a quick note where we came up with the name. We're I guess, friendly competitors that decided to get together. And the two competing companies are Safer Places and Secure Residential. And so we just basically took a word from each one and formed Safer and Secure. And we're going to hopefully have some fun along the way with that, and help to just bring to light and help people think about safety and security in whatever your world is, whether that be in a residential setting, which I know some of you are, or in hospitality, or whatever setting you're in. Hopefully, you'll be able to get some ideas. We're going to do these about once a month or so. And they will be up on our YouTube channel. So each one will be recorded, and if you like what you see, please tell others. So let me introduce our panelists today. Myself, I'm Dave Sawyer with Safer Places. My partner Steve Bukowski and Chris Lanny is from Secure Residential. And so, Chris, let me throw it over to you, and if you maybe could give us a little snapshot of your company and who you are.
Sure, Dave. Thank you. Thank you so much. So great to be here with you. So my name is Chris Lanny. I'm an independent security consultant. I work through my two firms, Secure Residential Services and Secure Building Services, out of Hudson, Mass. We work with, all different kind of venues, a lot of residential, but also hotels and commercial and educational. And it's a lot about just educating folks about security and security initiatives, how they work, what they are, what they're not, and then doing a lot of assessment work in terms of what's in place. Is it appropriate? Is it reasonable? Is it working? Except for making recommendations, as needed. We also do some litigation support work on claims of inadequate security, lack of security, negligence, et cetera, working with attorneys in security-related cases just to help assess and evaluate what's in place. So thank you for the opportunity. Great to be with you both. Great to collaborate.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And as I said, my name's Dave Sawyer, and I started Safer Places back in 2004. We're headquartered in Lakeville, Massachusetts. And we have two sides, just like Chris does. We have two sides to our company. Background screening, which is probably where I spend the bulk of my efforts these days. And then also we have our security consulting side. And my partner, who joined me in 2013, Stephen Bukowski, does the lion's share of the consulting work that we do. So Steve, let me throw it over to you, and please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Dave. So I'm Steve Bukowski, and like Dave said, I joined up with him about 10 years ago this April. Met Dave many years ago back at my old company, and where I was actually in security, sales, and design. So from there, I transitioned into consulting, where, like Chris, I meet with different verticals, whether it's housing, higher education, technology, to meet with them and discuss their technology-based security needs, and then help them, design solutions, whether it's new construction, existing facilities, create RFP packages, and then work with getting bids and so forth. So my specialty is really anything low voltage based at this point, because we're in a networking environment. So we can assist with that. So that's what I do with Dave, and then Dave's the brains behind most of the other stuff.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve. And welcome to all of you that are joining us today live. So today, we were discussing how are we going to, what's it going to be our first topic? What do we want to talk about? And I think it was Chris that had the idea first, to kind of do a review of 2022, since we're still, in the first quarter of 2023, and kind of take a look back. What are some of the major events in the security world that happened in 2022? And there was no shortage of them that we could talk about, and so that kind of set the stage for how could those events have had a better outcome than they ultimately did. And so I'm going to throw it over to Chris and have you talk a little bit about that, in specifically, Chris, about, you mentioned security initiatives earlier. Explain what you mean by that, and what we're going to be talking about today.
Right, right. So, I like to typically start off the conversation with some definitions, right? Because it's helped to understand what we're exactly talking about. And so what we see quite often in settings, when we talk about security, folks have a very kind of narrowed understanding of what that is, right? So it's a security officer from a security company in a security uniform out doing security tasks. And while that is in fact part of what security is, the reality is in all the settings we've talked about, it's really so much more, right? So as Steve talked about, it's use of technology, right? Cameras and access control equipment, and even simple locks and keys and lighting, and all these different hardware pieces that help you provide a reasonable level of security in a setting. Policy procedure, right? So the second bucket I talked to people about really is about how is a building run? How is a location being run? How do you deal with guests and visitors and others and incoming vehicles? And just operationally, what are the guidelines that the property is being run by, regardless of what it is, if it's a school or whatever the case might be? And then really finally, the last area that we talk about in terms of security, it's really the actions of individuals, right? So there's always a human component to that. And it's either, people who are dedicated to security, like we just talked about, security officers. It certainly could be, regular staff members. It could be guests, visitors, others, consultants, local police. I mean, there's a human piece in all this that we'll talk about a little bit. And it's just important when we talk about security, and we'll talk about this a little bit more down the road, just that it's, it's a broad application. It's just not that one narrow definition of what security might be at a location. And I think you talked about 2022, Dave. It was a busy year, right, in a lot of respects for all of us.
Yeah. So tell me, what are some of the changes that you witnessed in 2022 when it came to security programs and security initiatives?
Right. So I think that, some of the anecdotally, I will tell you what I in retrospect saw during the year was we certainly had an increase in discussion, right? I mean, there was just so many events happening on media that were really taking over the air, and people's thoughts were gravitating, and the conversations were gravitating toward those issues. With those discussions, like any other media event, right? You see it in the media, it's played and played and played again. It becomes a really hot topic, and then it kind of fades away in place of whatever the next hot topic might be. For the residential piece, where I do a lot of my work, the collapse in Surfside, Florida, right? It's a residential building that had infrastructure failures and collapsed. Was a big one, right? It was a big one for the residential community as a whole. It was a big one for infrastructure people, engineers, etc. Very, very big incident. A lot of media coverage, a lot of topics of conversation, and it actually related to security, not only just the infrastructure piece. There was a big fire in the Bronx early last year. Multifamily rental building had a fire with a pretty high death count, and it was again in the Bronx, and it was based really on a lot of failures of equipment and procedures that we can talk a little bit about as we get down the road. But again, a lot of publicity, a lot of discussion, a lot of increase. There was a case at the very end of the year last year, you may have seen on the news, out of Canada, out of Calgary. They had discovered what they identified as a forgery lab, right? That was actually operating in a condominium. So they had an entity come in, rent a unit under false pretenses, and run a legitimate, forgery operation in a condominium full time without really anybody knowing for a long period of time, right? So another one, big story. And then really finally, and really the most disturbing, is the gun violence, right? I mean, during the year last year, all year, and I've been on the residential side since 1998, and I can't ever recall these many active violence, active shooter events in the residential setting. But I mean, Atlanta, Toronto, Florida, one in Rome, right, where you have these multiple casualty gun violence events taking place, involving board members, involving property managers, at board meetings, at annual meetings, and again, just really got a tremendous amount of coverage, in the media. I think the other piece that we talked a little bit about, and we saw a lot in the year, was staffing, right? The uses of staffing, some of the challenges with staffing and hiring, and again, the creative use of alternatives to staffing. And Dave, I know you deal with a fair amount in some of your conversations with folks as well.
Yeah. In staffing, I mean, if you're in business at all, you've had problems with staffing in this past year. I mean, wages seem to be going through the roof, and even when you're paying what you think are reasonable or even top dollar wages, it's sometimes difficult to find the right talent to fill the positions. I certainly see that. I do a lot with writing specs for and putting out guard contracts out to bid, one of the things that I always have to caution my clients with is, we definitely want to write a tight spec so that everybody's bidding on the same thing. But one of the things that we don't want to do is to go with just the lowest bid. And that's going to be different than when Steve talks a little bit about technology, because if you write a tight spec with technology and everybody's bidding on the same thing, usually you can go with the lowest bid there. I mean, there might be service issues or whatever else, but with security, you have to be very careful with the wage rate that's going to be paid. So you're going with the low bid if you haven't specified a minimum for what the wage rates are going to be. You're going to get somebody that wants to come in and be the low bidder. So they and at least 60% of your bill when you're paying your guard contractor is wages. That's somewhere in that 60 to 70% range is going towards wages. So if you're getting low bid and you're not controlling how much they are required to pay those officers, you're going to see them struggling to find the right people, and you're going to see them with a lot of turnover. So that's definitely an issue. And then the other thing when we're consulting is what we're looking at is, and it's partially because of the difficulty that many are having in hiring, but it's also just because people are always looking for ways to save money, be more efficient, and improve security without spending a ton more money. So one of the things that we always look for is there a way to marry the staffing with the technology, so that maybe you're able to cut out a shift here and there and supplement that with technology, so that you're not really losing anything. In some cases, I even think it improves security by reducing staffing a little bit. I'm not saying you can ever reduce staffing. I mean, there's always going to be that human element. But Steve, let me throw it over to you and talk a little bit about the technology side of things.
Yeah, on the we'll focus more on the, I would say, technology wise, we've seen a big increase or improvement on video surveillance systems. As far as back in the days, you had very basic systems, and then you had really high-end systems that had more bells and whistles built into the software, built into the cameras. But those tended to go to very high budget jobs because they were very costly. So over the last couple of years, what we've seen is a huge drop in price of like cameras and so forth, but a huge improvement on the features that come with them. So a big thing that we're seeing now is a lot of cameras are coming standard with artificial intelligence, where it's analytics or smart search features. So you have a camera, the camera itself has the ability to generate alerts and push and notify people based on behaviors, whether it's loitering, speed, object detected. That's been around for a while in its early stages, but now that's becoming almost standard in a lot of lower cost cameras. And then when you couple those products with the right platforms, it can be even used further. And we have systems that integrate with radio. So if we have a guard touring a building and there's activity in a stairwell that we have that's not supposed to be, it will, through the radio, let them know that camera 10 in stairwell 1, there's activity. I mean, there's so many things you can do out there, and there's a budget range for everything. So we're able to do a lot more on lower budgets now. And instead of just being these very low tech, reactive based systems, they can now sort of be very intuitive to on-site security. And then at certain times they can push these alerts to critical people. We have voice over IP capability through VMS video management software now, how they integrate with your access control. It's just, and this keep track of that is our biggest challenge. We cannot sit there and just keep doing the same old thing. We always have to keep ourselves aware of what's trending, what's sort of too new, hasn't been vetted out, what is proving to be effective and what's not. So we try to maintain a very active relationship with both manufacturers and what's coming out, and then also integrators that are out in our territory and what they're seeing working successful, what sounds good on paper, and when they install it, it's not doing what it says. So it's a challenge for us, but it also makes it interesting because there are so many great things that are still coming out. So what we do design 3 months ago, if we were presented with that same design now, odds are we're changing products based on just improvements and availability.
All right, so we talked a little bit about staffing, a little bit about technology. So Chris, kind of bring those two together, if you would, and talk about some of those events that you mentioned earlier, the building collapse and the fire and so forth.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple of examples from last year that really speak really, really well to the idea of the human piece, the technology piece, and the policy piece. The building collapse in Florida, when you read about it and we listened to the news stories and did a lot of reading and research on it, it's a discussion of boards making decisions, not making decisions, funding, inspections that were not happening, et cetera. And it ultimately resulted in the failure of the building. And that's really the main story in there. But as you read some more and get into the nitty gritty details, what we learned is the night of the collapse, the building started to show signs of duress, right? Things were going on in the building that were not anticipated. Pipes are breaking and noises, et cetera. And there was a contract security officer on duty at the front desk, right? So the human piece, that person noticed that something was going on in the building, and they realized that it was kind of beyond their control. And following some kind of protocol, some kind of procedure, they dialed 911, right? So we know we have emergency services coming to investigate to see what's going on. We also know that in that period of time between when that call was made and when the building started to critically fail, we know it was about 10 minutes of time in there, right? About a 10-minute window. And what we know from the media sources is that during that 10-minute time, what did not happen is they did not activate an existing building evacuation system, which would have allowed a person on the front desk, the human piece, right, to use technology, an evacuation alert system, to start to get people out of the building, right? It's very hard to play the what if game, right? What happens if we did this, and to predict what would happen. But I think it's pretty much understood that had that evacuation been ordered and started at an earlier time, that there would have been somewhat of a different outcome in terms of the loss of life in that incident. But it's a great illustration of those pieces, right? The human piece, the procedural piece, right, and the technology piece. And I think that, Steve, I'm sure you see this in some of your sites, that, the use of these communication devices, whether it's a fire alarm system with an open mic, whether it's a dedicated communication system, whether it's a system that allows you to make phone blasts, right, or email blasts or text blasts, they play an integral part of, right, running the building from day to day, right, but also during critical incidents, and I think that technology's changed a lot actually over the years as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. We recently had a building, we'll consider it, I think it was about a 15-story building built in the 70s or 60s, and it had an old annunciation system. Now that had failed and it hadn't been working for years. So now this building was going through a renovation, and they wanted to put a paging system in the building that's outside of the fire alarm system. So we looked at many different ways, the traditional old school zone speakers. But part of the things that are happening is a lot of these buildings, in this particular case, they were outfitting the building with wireless access points. So all the residents have the capability of you getting emails and texts, not for streaming. Well, even in that scenario, they make wireless access points that have a speaker in them. So not only would it give that ability to provide internet access, but it could be used as a broadcasting measure on top of that. And even our intercom systems now, they're all technology network based. So if we had all the new voice over IP or SIP based systems, as we call it, from the desk, they could call every single resident at once, paging them through their apartment station. So there are so many things that are out there that are just coming up as part of the technology. It's all this networking world. So trying to deploy it in an effective, effective way is the challenge, but definitely some really much better options now.
Yeah. I mean, that communication piece, particularly when you're in the throes of a significant event, is just so critical. And like I said, it's hard to really judge what would have happened there in Florida, but certainly, it's safe to say that if I gave you 10 minutes to get as far away from me as you could probably cover some ground, if you knew something was going to go on. So unfortunate, but I think, in terms of the spirit of what the session is being called, there could have been somewhat of a different outcome there. I mean, I think a very similar thing could be said about, the Twin Parks fire in the Bronx in New York early last year. A fire in a unit that was attended to. So there were people in the unit at the time. A fire grew. The folks left the unit. They left their unit door open. They get into a stairwell. The fire alarms did eventually start to go off. the fire alarms in the building apparently had gone off on a daily basis for an extended period of time. According to the media, it was common fare for those alarms to be sounding every day. And so resident sensitivity to that was really dropped off. They, instead of evacuating when they started to hear those tones, they just kind of stood by, which was part of the problem. The evacuation routes, the stairwells, they had doors with closing hardware on them that were not functioning. So doors were not closing behind folks. So the stairwell doors were open. The stairwells filled full of smoke, and a lot of the casualties from that event that happened in the stairwells. And so when you talk about technology, sometimes we get the idea this is big, lofty, fancy, all these bells and whistles, but sometimes it could be as simple as door closing hardware and door latching hardware and things that are, again, hardscape, that are in a site that make a difference when need be, right? I mean, that's a perfect example. The control of smoke, the isolation of an incident, the making residents aware of what's going on, just educating residents what to do if you have a fire in your unit, right? If you see smoke, or if you, et cetera. Again, looking at all three of those buckets, it's really a telling event, because I think that it's agreed upon that things would have been a little bit different if again, doors had been closing properly and the system had monitored properly, residents had been aware and made aware differently, and education had been done a little bit differently. So it's a great example, tragic and very sad. If anything, hopefully some discussion comes out of it that brings awareness and brings some change.
Yeah, we see a lot of that, or I see a lot of that when I'm walking older facilities. Systems that have been in place for so long, 9 times out of 10, there is a door. If we look at it from just a security measure, the door is not closing properly, and it's an emergency stairwell. Well, it doesn't close, so that allows anybody to get themselves into the buildings, up the stairs, and through hardware that doesn't meet code, because we have to stay very involved with life safety, especially when you like door hardware. Stairwells, you can't be trapped in stairwells. There's a lot that comes into play to make sure that we're trying to provide a level of security, but we cannot restrict egress and things like that. So we have to work very closely with the authority having jurisdiction, which usually the fire chief, the door hardware consultants, if they exist, and then also obviously educate the client if this is an existing facility and that doesn't involve, but we see something that doesn't comply, because once we do anything to it, it needs to be brought up to code. So sometimes it's not as simple.
Yep.
So let me throw this out there. Let's pretend just for a second that we've reached that perfect world. We've got the right technology in place. We've got good staffing in place. Chris, let me throw this one to you. What would you think are the biggest risks? Even with all that in place, what are the risks? And I'm thinking kind of it's probably some kind of a mindset, right?
Right. So, I mean, I think the immediate answer you try to get to is, this third party that comes in and defeats security measures and acts out in a way and causes an injury or loss or damage. And so there are incident-based things that certainly are a risk. But I think you're right. In my experience, particularly during the course of the last year, I've had so many conversations with people who are trying to get themselves attuned to this idea of security that, I think a narrow mindset. I think I hear people say so often things like, well, we're in a nice community here, nothing bad could happen here, or, we're not in a bad place, and we've never had anything happen here before. I mean, I could just tell you anecdotally that just about every client I meet with who's had some kind of a significant event, during the course of that conversation, they always tell me, well, we never had anything like this happen before this, so there's not really a comfort. There shouldn't be a comfort in those things, but people do find some comfort to say, hey, listen, that, those bad things happen in bad places. They're not going to happen here. And I think that we've talked about the couple events here today. If you watch the news at all day to day, if you follow like Google alerts and look at certain types of events and do searches for that, I think you'll see these type of events happen every place. And I think if you've got a mindset where, not me, not here, it's not going to happen, it gets in your way of making reasonable decisions, right? And deploying reasonable measures, right? To make sure that if something does go on, you can respond to it. I mean, that's really, in my mind, one of the biggies. I think we talked earlier about the definition, about defining security. I think that creates some risk as well. People think that security is only this, and it's really not the case, right? We know that security fits into so many other jobs. The person in the management office who logs in residents or tenants by name, so there's a registry of people who are supposed to be in the building, not security. Well, kind of, right? Because you need to know who's in the space, right? And logging into vehicles and all these other tasks we do, they really are security based. So I think the idea of broadening our understanding of what security would be, and then finally, I think that the really big one, and Steve kind of talked about this a little bit, is the fact that you've got measures that go in place, they get put in place on day one. And I think that very often I hear people say that, well, this project is done, right? We did a review, we had the consultants come in, and Steve came in and did this. We put a system in place, and the cameras are up, and we're all done, And I try to tell people that's really kind of only the starting point, right? That's where things kind of start, right? You're using that tool, and there's going to be potential changes, right? So there's going to be changes in your immediate area. There's going to be changes within your space, change the use of space, change of demographics. Your risks will change. I mean, over time, things just change. And security is really not a set it and forget it kind of thing, right? You just don't put a measure in place and walk away. I mean, like Steve said, I same thing. I walk around buildings and I'll see a camera someplace or a certain piece of hardware someplace that makes no sense at all. And the answer is, well, this used to be whatever fitness center, and we moved it a couple of years ago. And we never changed anything, and so it really, folks have got to be continuously evaluating what's going on, looking at crime data, looking at their space, looking at their incident trending internally, and making sure that as adjustments need to be made, they're made, right? Because you'll find yourself on the other end of the spectrum where what you've done is not going to be addressing the issues. And I think those three things really collectively, if people could work a little bit better in those three areas, I think make a huge difference, a very, very big difference in the risk level at sites.
All right, so we're getting kind of close to our half hour. We said we'd try to keep these to half an hour. So let me just throw it open to all of you, both of you. Any last thoughts? Anything that we didn't cover that we should?
Steve, you want to take it first?
What's that?
You want to go first, or you want me to run with it?
I'll just say this, kind of running off what Chris said. Dave and I, we go to all these different sites, and they do vary. They take on a life of their own. So when we meet with the property manager or the regional manager, if it's new construction, and they sort of have their own templates on what they want to see, but every location can pose a very different challenge. So we try to do our best for creating designs that lend themselves to being expanded upon, but it's very hard to predict the behavior of a site once people move in or once you put these things in, because it is a nature to the problems move. And we used to say it's not in my backyard. So some clients will say, I'll just put a ton of cameras, and they'll push all the problems to the neighbor next to them, and it goes away. But what I have seen is that people have become less afraid of cameras now. They're all over the place. They're very brazen about it. So it really, in my mind, we're trying to create systems that aren't so reaction. Something happens and I'll go back and I'll get a video. Really, the technology, the features are there from day one. It's just a matter of taking advantage of it and using it and training and retraining and being aware of what it can and can't do. Because I find that most of the time, if a system's 5 years old at this point, they're just logging in. Can you retrieve a clip for me? And spent this money, and they can do so much, and it's just not being taken advantage of.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, you touch upon, I talked a little bit about it as well, is that, the idea of preparing, right? Being prepared. I talk to clients and they often have in the back of their mind the financial implications of anything they do, right? How is it going to affect our finances, or the physical space, right? How is it going to impact our infrastructure, and how is that change going to make things different for us here? And really, I think folks need to keep in mind as well that all these things have implications on security. So the sites that I see that do it the best, they keep that security component in the back of their mind when they look at a space and look for changes or doing whatever. They still are saying to themselves, will that affect the level of security in the building, and things we should be considering? And I think the preparing part, Benjamin Franklin and Winston Churchill both talked a lot about this, and they both have quotes that talk about failing to prepare, right? So if you're failing to plan, you're going to plan to fail, right? It doesn't work that way. And and I'll tell you, just I think the COVID pandemic tells us as well that folks who all of a sudden now had to try to control access to spaces or use the technology different, or try to get their cameras, as Steve said, to do things for them, have them become smart for us, under the circumstances that we were working in. A lot of folks didn't have any idea where to begin with that, right? There was no discussion, no planning, no thoughts about that at all. And it was on the fly, and on the fly can work sometimes, but honestly, as we've kind of learned, a couple of things we talked about, doesn't necessarily always work that well. So trying to plan a little bit, prepare a little bit, I think goes a long, long way. So.
Agreed.
All right. Well, let's do this. Let me share my screen again, and we should have that in slideshow mode, though. And Well, that's not what I wanted, but we'll get to the right spot here. So yeah, I wanted to get up our company information. So quick half hour. Thank you guys both for sharing your expertise, and obviously only so much you can cover. Hopefully, I think our intent was to just whet the appetite. If you've got questions, here are the two companies that are involved in this: Safer Places, Secure Residential. Feel free to reach out to either of us. Phone numbers are up there, websites, email, and so forth. We're always happy to hear from people. If you have a suggestion for a future podcast, we'd love to hear that. And if you hang in with us just another minute or two here, we do have a topic that we're going to be planning on for next time. So we'll hopefully whet your appetite with that as well. And I wanted to see if there were any questions. I didn't see any up on the screen. Did either of you guys see any of those?
I did not see questions.
Okay, so you got like 30 seconds if you're participating live here with us to throw one in. We'd be happy to take it right now. Otherwise, again, we're available. You can find us easily, I think, phone or email. And then next time, so we're going to talk about the future is here. And a lot of times I'm really surprised, actually, because, you know, I kind of live in this world, and I'm guessing Steve and Chris, you too. But you hear people say, really, you can do that now? So, you know, it made me think of the Jetsons. I mean, I was a kid watching the Jetsons, and that was like so futuristic, and all that stuff has come to fruition now. Chris, you found the graphic of the supermarket there.
Yeah.
Is that an actual supermarket that you visit?
Yeah, well, no. So that's a picture offline, but it is from Stop and Shop, and Stop and Shop had deployed some of these units at some of their different stores. We happen to be one, and I think it was on the Cape at one point. And it's it's pretty interesting when you kind of mind your own business walking down the produce aisle, and this thing comes up on you. You know, it's it's interesting.
And the future is here. Yeah, that's a great reminder of that. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. We hope you can join us. We'll get an announcement out on a date on that. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. Once we get that up and running in the next day or two, we'll get an announcement out. So thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.